My name is Jamie Roughton. I'm the political science professor at Greenville Technical College. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce Dr. Patterson, and then I'll let him take it away. So we are greatly honored to have Dr. Thomas Patterson joining us here at Greenville Technical College on Constitution Day. In a time where the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are often at the center of many societal debates on an array of subjects, Dr. Patterson will help us see the contemporary times and actors of the Constitution while drawing correlations and variances to our time. This is certainly an exciting and important topic. Dr. Patterson is the Bradlee Professor of Government and Press at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He's an accomplished author, authoring books on American government, misinformation, media, political parties, and a host of other important facets of our political system. Including among his many works are Out of Order, an insightful work analyzing the media's political role. This received the American Political Science Association's Graeber Award as the best book of the decade in political communication. And his work, Unseeing Eye, an examination of television's role in elections, was named by the American Association for Public Opinion Research as one of the 50 most influential books on public opinion in the past half century. I personally had the pleasure of making his acquaintance through the upcoming 13th edition of his American Government introductory textbook, We the People. I hope all of you online will join me in welcoming Dr. Patterson. Thank you, Dr. Patterson. We are excited to have you here.
Oh, Jamie, thank you for the nice introduction. And it's really an honor to be with all of you on Constitution Day. I'm from Boston, the birthplace of the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party were early signs that Americans were tiring of British rule. And it was from Boston that British troops marched to Lexington and Concord to face off with colonial militiamen in what became the first battle of the American Revolution. Later on, the Revolutionary War came to South Carolina. The British attacked and captured Charleston and then landed one of their armies with the goal of taking over your state, which would have had the effect of also isolating Georgia. South Carolina was the state, I don't know if you knew this, where the largest number of Revolutionary War battles, more than 200 in all, were fought. And in the end, those battles proved quite decisive. They weakened the British Army based in South Carolina to such an extent that when Cornwallis called for it to move north to reinforce him at Yorktown, Virginia, it had little to offer. And of course, the American victory at Yorktown effectively ended the war and gave the United States its independence from Britain. The part of the United States where I grew up was not involved in the Revolutionary War. Native Americans were the primary inhabitants, mostly Sioux, along with a smattering of French and British traders. I grew up in Minnesota in a small farming town of 1,000 people, very near the Iowa and South Dakota borders. My first exposure to your part of the country, indeed to any part of the country beyond that small little corner of the upper Midwest, was after graduating from college. I had gone through the ROTC program and upon being commissioned, was sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, having volunteered to serve in the U.S. Army Special Forces. As part of my training, I had a brief stint in Fort Jackson. And a little more than a year later, I was in Vietnam, having been deployed there as part of the war effort. That brief stint at Fort Jackson was the first time that I'd set foot in South Carolina. And if not for COVID, I'd be happily back there with you on Constitution Day. South Carolina, by the way, was the 8th state to ratify the Constitution. Adoption of the Constitution required 9 states. Ratification by the 9th state, New Hampshire, came a month after South Carolina had voted to join the Union. So September 17th, 1787, that was 233 years ago today. It was on that date that delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia signed the final draft of the Constitution. A century later, the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, declared the Constitution to be the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. The most wonderful work ever. That's high praise, but it was deserved. The Constitution had changed how the world thought about government. Until it was written, ultimate governing authority throughout the world had rested in the hands of kings, caliphs, mandarins. Their word was law. The Constitution vested that authority in a document. Words on paper would be the highest authority. Now today we take that idea for granted. In 1787, it was a revolutionary idea. To fully appreciate it, imagine yourself living in 1700 Europe. First off, your possibilities in life would be dictated by the circumstances of your birth. If you were born a commoner, which was the lot of 98% of the people, you were denied rights and privileges reserved for the 2% of noble birth. The law under which you were governed might change from one day to the next, depending on the whims of the king. And if the king died, the law would almost certainly change under the new king. And you could only hope that the new king didn't turn out to be a tyrant. Some did. The US Constitution changed the rules, and not simply by instituting what John Adams, who was a delegate at the Constitutional Convention and later the second president of the United States, called a government of laws, not of men. The Constitution placed limits on the powers of government. It included denials of power. For example, a ban on ex post facto laws, which are laws that make acts illegal, even though they were legal at the time that they were committed. It protected individual rights from abridgment by government. For example, under the Constitution, you have the right of habeas corpus, meaning that if charged with a crime, you have the right to be brought before a judge and have the judge decide whether the charges are warranted. In European countries in the 1700s, the king could toss you in jail without charge and throw away the keys. Thousands died by that method. That power would be denied to those in authority in America. And most importantly, the Constitution contained built-in checks on power. The writers of the Constitution understood that words alone would not deter power-hungry leaders. So they separated the powers of government among three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial, and gave each branch the ability to check the power of the other two. For example, by giving the president the power to veto acts of Congress. Now, this system hasn't always worked as intended. It failed to protect Black Americans who, even after slavery was abolished, waited a century before they had equal rights under the law. Native Americans also waited until the 1960s to gain equality under the law. Women, too, had to wait, as did other underprivileged groups. Of the nation's founding principles, equality, without doubt, has been the hardest to achieve. It's an issue that as a nation, we're still struggling with, as we've seen this year in the many efforts to advance the cause of racial justice. Now, from another perspective, the Constitution has been a total success. We've found it good enough to keep it around. The US Constitution is the world's oldest constitution continuously in force. That's a remarkable achievement. In the period that we've been governed by one constitution, France has tried 19 different times to get it right. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake for you to assume that the Constitution alone accounts for the stability of America's governing system. When South American countries won their independence from Spain in the 1800s, they adopted constitutions modeled after the US Constitution, in some cases nearly word for word. not one of those republics lasted. Each fell under military rule within a relatively short period of time. Words on paper were not enough. The writers of the US Constitution themselves worried that the republic they established might not last. George Washington predicted that the American people at some future time, out of ignorance, animosity, and fear, would fall under the spell of a homegrown tyrant. When Benjamin Franklin, after having signed the Constitution, was asked what type of government it had created, he replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." If you can keep it. Ultimately, we are the guardians of the governing system that was created in 1787. And that's perhaps why Congress, in designating September 17th as Constitution Day, also has designated it as Citizenship Day. And a question I think we should ask is whether we're doing our part to protect our country. According to the Democracy Project, which monitors the health of democracies around the world, we're not doing a very good job. The Democracy Project has identified several countries in which democracy is weakening. India is on the list, as is Brazil. So too are Hungary and Turkey. The United States is also on the list. We're cited not for flaws in our Constitution, but for our failure to uphold the norms upon which democracy depends. Our democracy is not in danger of failing. That's not what I'm saying. But it's weaker today than a few decades ago because of the erosion of governing norms. One of these norms is mutual tolerance, the idea that our political opponents are rivals and not enemies. But that's not the way many Republicans and Democrats see each other today. Huge numbers of them, according to the polls, believe that those in the other party are a grave threat to the nation's well-being. One indicator that pollsters use to assess tolerance is a question that reads, would you object if your son or daughter married a blank, fill in the blank, married someone of a different faith, married someone of a different race, married a Republican, married a Democrat? Now, when that question was asked in the 1960s in the context of partisanship, less than 1 in 20 parents objected to having a child marry across party lines. Today, the number is 8 times that high. And marriage statistics indicate that they're not kidding. Today, only 1 in 10 marriages, new marriages, unites a Republican and a Democrat. It turns out that we don't like much of anything about members of the other party. At the top of Democrats' list, according to a recent national survey, is a belief that Republicans are closed-minded. Closed-minded also tops Republican lists when they were asked about Democrats. Dishonest and immoral also ranked high when Democrats and Republicans were asked to judge those in the other party. And what positive traits do we associate with the other party? None, as it turns out. Large numbers said that members of the other party make them feel frustrated, angry, afraid. Now, it would be one thing if our divide stopped with our party loyalties, but it doesn't. When I was an undergraduate political science major and took the American Political Parties course, we read that each of our major parties was a big tent. Each had the support of a large proportion of nearly every group you could think of. That's not the look of today's Republican and Democratic parties. 90% of the Republican vote in 2016 came from non-Hispanic whites. Today's Republican Party is largely a white party. America's minority groups are lined up on the other side. In 2016, Black Americans voted 90% Democratic, Hispanics 70% Democratic, Asian Americans 70% Democratic. Religion is also a dividing line. Over 60% of regular churchgoers voted Republican in 2016. Among those who go to church irregularly or not at all, it was the reverse. Over 60% voted Democratic. The two-party vote among men and women, the women's vote in 2016 divided nearly 3-2 Democratic. The men's vote, nearly 3-2 Republican. Urban-rural, urban areas went roughly 2-1 Democratic in 2016. Rural areas, 2-1 Republican. We've separated ourselves into two tribes, each with a political party at its center. Tribalism is a threat to a healthy democracy. When opposing partisans look differently than we do, live in different places than we do, have lifestyles that differ from ours, it becomes much easier to demonize them. Democracy thrives when people accept each other and look out for one another. That's what's meant by mutual tolerance. When people respect each other, they're more willing to work together. They are also more trusting. The number of Americans who believe most people can be trusted has fallen by half in recent decades. And we're especially wary of those in the other party. Today, only about 1 in 5 Americans looks upon those in the other party as trustworthy. Now, a second norm that supports a healthy democracy is forbearance. It refers to the idea that power should be used with restraint rather than taken to its lawful limits. Our Constitution includes checks on power, but constitutional restraints are not by themselves enough. Those in power and those who put them in power need to recognize that the opposing side has legitimate rights and interests, and that calls for restraint in the use of power. But that's not what we've seen in Washington in recent years. Presidents, members of Congress have pushed the limits of the law and often refused even to talk with, much less accommodate, those on the other side of the aisle. And we've been part of that problem. When lawmakers on our side of the partisan divide act badly, we applaud them. When lawmakers on the other side do much the same thing, we condemn them. When forbearance is cast aside, our worst impulses come out in other ways as well. Incidents of anti-Semitism have nearly doubled in the past 2 years. Incidents of Islamophobia have more than doubled. Hate crimes rooted in race and ethnicity are up sharply. Hate has entered the mainstream of American politics, and it's going to be hard for us to root it out. A third norm that underpins democracy is respect for the truth. Now, a breakdown in Americans' willingness to come to grip with facts might seem like a small problem given the other two norms that I mentioned. But once people lose touch with and respect for truth, other things begin to unravel. And sadly, we're losing our respect for truth. Conspiracy theories are nothing new. I'm old enough to remember when fluoride was first added to the water to prevent against cavities. That era's conspiracy theorists told it was a communist plot aimed at destroying the brain cells of America's children. But never in our history have conspiracy theories been so widespread as they are today. Some defy all notions of common sense. The idea that some of our political leaders are running a massive child sex ring is beyond ridiculous. But many Americans, the number is larger than the entire population of South Carolina, believe that it's true. It's the case, moreover, that conspiracy theories are the smaller part of our truth problem. Our minds are filled with misinformation on one issue after the next. Despite the unanimous conclusion of the nation's 16 intelligence agencies that Russia meddled in the 2016 election and is doing it again this time, huge numbers of Americans believe otherwise. I'm not talking here about uninformed voters. I'm talking about misinformed voters. The misinformed think they know what they're talking about, but they don't have a clue. Now, that would not be such a big problem if misinformation was randomly distributed across the population, but it's not. It's usually concentrated among those who identify with one party or the other. Democrats and Republicans are not only political opponents today, they have wildly different views of reality. And that makes it nearly impossible for them to have a thoughtful discussion. How do you discuss an issue if you can't even agree on basic facts? And the problem goes beyond talking. It's crippling our ability to respond sensibly to policy problems. A recent Gallup poll found that 1 in 4 Americans believe that COVID-19 is no more deadly than the seasonal flu. And those who hold this belief are much less likely to practice social distancing or wear a face mask when in public. The facts say otherwise. Health scientists now have the data from millions of flu and COVID infections. And the data indicate that COVID is more than 10 times deadlier than the flu. The refusal of Americans to respond to the reality of COVID has put their lives and the lives of others at risk. We have one of the world's best healthcare systems, yet our death rate per capita from COVID ranks in the top 10. We have a worse death rate than more than 180 countries around the world. COVID-19 represents the biggest public health failure in the nation's history. And as a people, we need only to look at ourselves for one of the reasons. As conservative columnist David Brooks noted, there's been a breakdown in America's ability to face evidence objectively, to pay due respect to reality, to deal with complex and unpleasant truths. He goes on to say, once a country tolerates dishonesty, incuriosity, and intellectual laziness, then everything else falls apart. Let me close with a few thoughts on how you can honor the nation's heritage. Vote when you have the opportunity, but do more than vote. Be tolerant of those who think differently. Listen to them. We can learn from listening carefully to those on the other side of the partisan divide. And if your side wins this fall's election, remember that the losing side has legitimate rights and interests that deserve your respect. Act with restraint and demand restraint from your officials. Finally, take the time to inform yourself. Express your opinions, but make sure they're rooted in facts and not the false claims that are crippling our ability to think and act sensibly. Thank you for listening. I'd be delighted to respond to questions. Also be delighted to respond to any objections that you might have to what I just said. Jamie.
Okay, so we have a list of questions from students, as you know, and so I'm just going to read them with the student's first name, and then you can respond. So first question is Nathan. How can the political arguments of the framers relate to the arguments in society today?
Nathan, that's a great question. I think the parallels are intriguing. You know, when we think back on the writing of the Constitution, somehow we think that, you know, all of these very thoughtful, reflective individuals got together and sort of, you know, we can do this better. We can come up with a better form of government than we've had. But actually, it was almost an act of desperation. The country was coming apart in 1787. The separate states had worked together during the Revolutionary War because individually they stood no chance against the British Army. They had a chance collectively. That succeeded. But after the war, the states started to go their separate ways. They began to do things that that advanced their interest at the expense of the interests of the other states. A common public policy at that time was to raise high tariffs on goods coming from neighboring states. States were trying to cripple the economies of neighboring states to benefit their own economies. And there were lots of other divisions that were happening in society at that time. There was still there was a very deep division over slavery. There were deep divisions over religion. And the question was whether how much influence religion should have on our politics, with one side saying religion ought to be out of politics, and the other side saying that religion ought to deeply infuse our politics. There was a huge split between the cities and the rural areas over the shape of the future economy, whether it would be based largely on commerce or whether it would be largely an agrarian, rural society. I mean, and we think about the divisions today and the splits in America today, and they coincide in very strong ways with that. And the biggest split, perhaps of all, at this period of time was about the power of the central government. This was an issue that cut through every state and every interest group in the country, with some arguing for a stronger federal government and some argue for a stronger state-centered system of government. So I see a reflection of many of the issues of today in what was done at Philadelphia in 1787. Now, in that case, they had the good sense to come together and try to figure out how to deal with it, how to overcome it, not to ignore it, not to push the issues to the side, but what do we need to do to make this country a better place? And I think that piece of the thinking of 1787 is too often lacking in the minds of our lawmakers as they center their thinking so squarely on the next election and whether they personally will be back and also whether they can find ways to really blame the other party for everything that's going wrong and with little attempt to get together with the other party to try to fix some of these pressing problems that we have as a nation.
Well, thank you. The next question is from Lauren, and it's, when the Constitution was ratified, were there opposing viewpoints as to what type of government should be established for the United States, such as a republic, parliamentary, monarchy? What were some of the different ideas?
So the parliamentary model was never really considered seriously. Now, maybe if the Constitution had been written 100 years later, it would have been. The parliamentary democracies that we know today were really creatures not of the 18th century when our Constitution was written, but of the 19th century. That's when you had most of the European revolutions. And they opted for the parliamentary system. And the reason they did that, unlike our system, which is really designed to limit the power of government, the Europeans at that time understood that they needed to empower government because what they needed to do was to take power away from the landed aristocracy that had dominated those countries for centuries. So they really needed a system that had significant power in the hands of ordinary people. And a parliamentary system does that. It's much closer to a system of direct majority rule than the one that we have. They don't separate the executive and legislature. And if a party wins a majority in the election, it basically can pretty much do what it wants to do in the legislative body. In the American case, we divide power. And not only do we divide it between the executive and legislature, but we split it between the House and Senate on the legislative side. And those are two quite different bodies. So in the American case, it's much more, how do you overcome these restrictions on power if you want to get things done? And that was very much the founders' design. And that's why they called it republic and not a democracy. They rejected the idea that this should be called a democracy. They called it a compound republic. And what they meant by that was that there was power at the state level, there was power at the national level, and then at both levels, the power was divided. That's compound way of thinking about how power should be exercised. So they never seriously considered the parliamentary form. And the American Revolution was a rejection of monarchy as a form of government. There were some voices that wanted to make George Washington into a king. And thankfully, Washington wasn't interested in that kind of office. He was an exemplary man. And that two-term limit, which he set, and it was at the time, this was not worked into the Constitution. It was later became an amendment to the Constitution to limit the president to 2 terms. He voluntarily left office after 2 terms. He actually wanted to leave after 1 term. He wanted to set an example that office is not permanent and that turnover of office is important. And the idea that these offices belong to the people through their voice was fundamental in his thinking. And monarchy was the last thing on his mind. And of course, even though we think of them now kind of as conservative voices in a way, when you write a constitution, that makes you a conservative almost. But these people were radicals. These were revolutionaries. We revolted against the king. These were rebels, right? And if we'd lost the war, a lot of the people who were in the Constitutional Convention and that convention all would have been hanging from the nearest gallows if we'd lost the war. So they were rebels, but they were conservative in their thinking, wanting to really limit the power of government. That led them to the republic model. But they didn't have a lot of good guideposts. They had the experiences of the states and before that of the colonies, but past history was not a great guide. You almost had to go back to, the Roman Senate to find something close to what they were thinking about. And it was not a model that could be transported here. They invented something quite original and quite beautiful. Anything that lasts as long as it has as a governing instrument is well designed, and it certainly is.
If you, this question is from Elizabeth, if you had to rewrite the Constitution today, based on how the world is, would you change anything about it, or would the same principles and concepts still apply?
That's a terrific question, actually. So let me pretend that I'm one of the framers, or let's pretend that we can bring them all forward. So they wrote the Constitution in 1787, and they didn't say, I'm going to think back to 1587. They didn't say, I'm going to go back 200 years and put my mind into that time period and figure out what a constitution ought to look like given the conditions of 1587. They were very contemporary. They were living in 1787 and thinking about what's going on right now and what do we have to do to ensure the future. So they were looking at the present and looking ahead, taking some lessons from the past, certainly, but future-oriented. So I think if they were to be here today and look at the experiences that we've had with the Constitution, they would make some changes. They would absolutely throw out the Electoral College. That would just go out the window about day one. They were kind of at a loss when they came up with the Electoral College. They, for reasons of not wanting to put too much power into the presidency, they rejected at that time direct election. If they could review what's happened since then with the direct election of the president, and the Electoral College would make no sense at all to them as a mechanism for which Americans would choose their chief executive. So I think that would be one major change. And certainly, and this was a really tough choice that they faced in 1787. And if they came today, it would never have gotten into the Constitution, but put yourself back into their time now, not our time. The hardest issue that they addressed at the Constitutional Convention was slavery. And it was an unforgiving issue in many ways. So they faced a choice that they didn't want to face. Most of the delegates hated slavery and thought it was really a blot on America, and a real contradiction with the words that basically inspired people to rally around the revolution. The idea that all men are created equal. There was no way to reconcile that with slavery. Just absolutely no way whatever. But the Southern delegates, including those from South Carolina, said, you either tolerate it, you either accept it, or we're going to break away right now. We'll leave this convention. We'll set up our own states of America, whatever it might be called, right? So, and they weren't kidding, they weren't joking. So there was the choice. Do you have a United States that includes the South, or do you have a United States that excludes the South, and they set up yet a different government on the North American continent? And the delegates, a majority of them decided, we'll do this dirty deal because we want the states to stay together. We want the states united. And we'll push that issue down the road. And they did that with, for example, the provision that banned the importation of additional slaves after 1808. They knew that that issue would come to a head at some point. I don't think they envisioned a civil war, or they would have in 1787 have made the opposite decision they did and say, just go away South, you go set up your own government, slave-based economy, and we'll do something different from that. Maybe we'll look north to Canada for the people or the kind of governments that can join our union. So I think that was the toughest one. I think, that, but it was damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I know it's uncomfortable for many of you to think about that period and to blame them for the choice they made. And but they had two bad choices, not two good ones. Not a good one and a bad one, two bad ones. And they made what they thought was the lesser of the bad ones.
Yeah. I was going over that just the other day with my students. So our next question is Andrew. From Andrew, what is your theory on why voter participation is so dreadful in the U.S.?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, Andrew, and you're certainly right in your facts, so I can't, you're certainly is consistent with what I said about the importance of paying attention to the facts. We do have dreadful voter turnout. We're really kind of at the low end among Western democracies. Switzerland actually tends to come in a little bit lower, but they're kind of a special case. I won't go into the Swiss politics, but and this actually relates a little bit to the previous question, kind of what might the framers change in the original Constitution. So in 1787, and it's reflected in the body of the Constitution. If you read the Constitution in original form, you'll note that it says nothing about people having the right to vote. And why is that? Well, because at the time, voting for the most part was restricted to property owning white males, right? So if you said that citizens have a right to vote, all of a sudden you got to give women the vote. And they didn't want that and weren't accustomed to that. And certainly be even a bigger contradiction to say you can have slaves who can't vote, but they're here, right? So that was a problem. So they basically passed off that responsibility to the states. And what the Constitution specifies is that the states basically can set the terms for voting with one provision, that it cannot be harder to vote in federal elections than it is to vote in the election for the lower house of the state legislature. That gives states a lot of leeway in terms of how they go about running their elections, conducting their registration process and the like. Now, subsequently, there have been some changes in terms of the laws that have restricted states' ability to limit the vote. Voting Rights Act of 1965, for example, banned really the practices common in your state and other southern states that effectively barred African Americans from voting. I think in South Carolina, less than 10% of Black Americans until 1965 were registered to vote. And wasn't because they weren't eligible, it was because of the obstacles that white officials placed in front of them: literacy tests, poll taxes, all sorts of ways, intimidation, if you tried to register to vote, and so on. So there are now some federal limits on what states can do, but still, it's very much up to the states to set some of these rules. And as we've seen in recent years, many states have made it harder to vote, not easier to vote. You'd think they'd love to have people vote. And politicians always say, oh, it's great, we need you to get all the polls, everybody should vote. But actually, they only want some people to vote. That's been characteristic of politicians from kind of day one. So I think the only way that we're going to get something like really high voting rates is to change the registration process and move towards something like what European countries do. If you live in Germany, for example, and you move from one place to the next, the post office will notify the election office that you've changed residency and need to be registered to vote at the new place. You don't have to lift a finger to become registered to vote. In the US, you have to take the initiative. You've got to go get yourself registered. You know, if we could get something like the European system, we would immediately jump 10, 15 points, no doubt, in the level of our voter turnout. Turnout would be bigger. Registration is a huge obstacle that prevents a lot of Americans from going to the polls. Now you say it's their fault, or you could argue that it's their fault, but you know, many people don't know where the election clerk's office is. When's the last time you saw that publicized? When's the last time you got kind of a notice, you know, go to this address between these hours? In some places, the clerk's office may be open half a day a week. That's deliberate, trying to keep down access to voting. Come on, a lot of hijinks here, and have been from the beginning of the Republic. And we need to move past that. And what's really been heartening to me is if you look at the polls, young people your age, actually don't have much tolerance for this nonsense that's been going on in lots of areas, right? That's true. You're really tired of politics as usual. You want change, you want reform, you want good government, you want clean elections. You know, that voice is really getting heard. And I do think in another 10, 20, or 30 years, that's usually what these kinds of reforms, that's how long they take. I think will dramatically change the way that elections are conducted, how easy it will be for people to vote, and how welcoming we will be to the vote and to voters. But that's not our story at the moment.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing especially with my younger students. There is a definite kind of tiring of the political system as it is, and the polarization as it is. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, no, you're right, Jamie. And the great thing is that we've seen this in the past to some degree, the disgruntled young people. But I think what's different this time is they're actually putting their foot into the arena, right? So in the past, as you know, too often, they grumbled but didn't do anything, right? But I really see really strong activism on the part of America's young adults, and that can change things.
Definitely can. So our next question is from Dennis. During the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, were there any states or a state that didn't ratify the Constitution?
There were two that would have liked not to ratify it. So at the Constitutional Convention, I think the delegates understood that if they required unanimous consent, all of the states to consent to the new Constitution, it would never be adopted. And they knew that actually precisely. Rhode Island had refused to send a delegation to the Constitutional Convention. They wouldn't even participate in the negotiations. So Rhode Island was out there, and they knew it was unlikely for Rhode Island to vote for ratification. And they feared some of the other states might not too. So they said 9 of the 13, once we get to that level, then we'll have a union. And if the other states don't want to be part of the union, good. It was a pretty close call in Virginia and in New York. Both of those states were big states. Virginia was bigger than it is today. Many of you may not know that West Virginia was part of Virginia, but it was broken off because of the Civil War. Virginia lost that part of the state because of the Civil War. It was formed as a separate state as a response to Virginia's participation in the war between the states. But, you know, Virginia was a big state, powerful state. New York was a big state, powerful state. Conceivably, these states could have gone it on their own. They were as big as many of the European countries and had the natural resources that many of them lacked. Given time, these would have been pretty significant nations unto themselves. And there was some sentiment in both of those states not to join the Union for that reason. The vote was close in both states, but favorable. So they're in. So now you ended up with 11. First 9 came pretty easy. As I said, South Carolina was 8, New Hampshire was 9, New York, Virginia, 10 and 11. Rhode Island's out, North Carolina's out. So your neighbor to the north was not in. They didn't want it either. And for reasons that are less clear than Rhode Island's. Rhode Island's was a debtor's colony, and they had taken over control of the government, and they just feared this becomes federalized. We're going to lose all this control that we've acquired. But they saw the writing on the wall because the other states started to move. They started actually to act like a union, and that meant that they would have a big army. They would have a lot of economic muscle, and North Carolina would be tiny little North Carolina, and Rhode Island would be even tinier little Rhode Island. And it was more the reality that the other states were moving on without them that led them to ratify. So they came in late, quite late actually in the process.
Okay. So our next question is from Abigail, and it is, are there any political events that have happened that go against the Constitution? And if so, why were they allowed to occur?
There are some glaring abuses of the constitutional system. Slavery, obviously, but slavery was baked into the original Constitution, as we've talked about. To me, the most glaring example is how we treated Japanese Americans during the Second World War. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, soon thereafter, Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order requiring Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, and that's where most of them were concentrated. They had to sell their homes and move inland, be relocated. They actually were moved to what we call relocation camps, but actually look like concentration camps. And so all of those people were displaced. And of course, the argument was that they weren't trustworthy, right? That they would side with Japan in our war with Japan. One of the great ironies of all of this is that we allowed Japanese Americans to serve in Europe during the war. They couldn't serve in the Pacific Theater. They could serve in Europe. I don't remember the number of the regiment, but the most decorated regiment in World War II was a Japanese American regiment. had 23 winners of the Congressional Medal of Honor. It actually was the most decorated regiment in the history of the United States. They were loyal Americans, and we incarcerated them basically for 4 years. So Roosevelt issued the executive order. Congress voted on the executive order unanimously, upholding it. Not one of them had the courage to say this is unconstitutional. 3 times that issue went to the Supreme Court. Each time the Supreme Court upheld as constitutional this clear violation of the rights of American citizens, right? So why? Necessity. The Constitution always bends to necessity. If you get all 3 branches, and again, one of the great features of our system is checks and balances, but they break down when all 3 branches agree on a constitutional violation. We needed to have one of those branches stand up, and none of them did. I could give you other examples like that. So look, it hasn't always worked. I tell you, it doesn't work all that well when the president does something really bad and his or her party controls the Congress. They're not going to do much in that case, right? So, so partisanship can also weaken the constitutional design. Of course, the framers of the Constitution, parties came after the Constitution was written, not before, and they were worried about the effects of parties. They came to grudgingly admire them because you need them to give people choices, but they worried about the worst effects of what they called faction. And one of the worst effects of faction is around abridgments of the Constitution, when people act outside, lawmakers act outside the Constitution, and they don't get checked because those in control of the other branches are from the same party. And we've seen that a number of times, not a dramatic number, but a number of times in American history. And it's been a problem in recent years, to be honest with you.
Okay. So the next question is, today's politics seems very divisive and confrontational. In what ways were the politics of 1787 similarly divisive and confrontational? For example, was there a great deal of conflict between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams or other framers of the Constitution, particularly surrounding the issues of states' rights? And that's from Anna.
Yeah, so Anna, so I think I talked a little bit about that, about kind of the parallel conflicts of 1787 and some of the conflicts we're having today. So let me kind of more narrowly address your question. So Jefferson, to me, is one of the most intriguing of the founding fathers. A man of great talent, but also one of enormous contradictions. And so Jefferson was not one of the framers. He was an ambassador to France at the time the Constitution was written, or he would have been in Philadelphia. There's no question he would have been there, but he was overseas. And he didn't like parts of the Constitution. He thought it was needed. He thought they generally got it right. He thought they gave too little power to the people, to ordinary people. And that was part of his argument throughout much of his life. There was a piece of that argument for equality that he deeply believed in. But as you know, he was also a slaveholder. And so the person who wrote about all men being equal held slaves, an enormous contradiction. Fairly early in his career in Virginia, he introduced a bill that would have basically ended slavery in Virginia and almost killed his political career. So that might have been a truer statement of how he felt about slavery than some of his subsequent actions. his political career depended on not taking that stand again, and he never did. It's not clear that he ever gave up that belief. What confounds the question is, unlike Washington, he also didn't free his slaves at his death. So, you know, he went to his grave, a man of contradictions. And he had a lot of contradictions about the power of government, you know, about states' rights. So early in the Washington administration, when Alexander Hamilton wanted to establish a national bank, Hamilton dreamed of a commercially oriented U.S., a powerful, economically powerful country. Jefferson's image was more of a rural, agrarian image of what would be the best society. Jefferson lost that one to Hamilton. Hamilton prevailed with Washington. And Jefferson responded by making arguments about states' rights. Right? Yet, when he was president of the United States, he probably did the most aggressive executive national action that a president has ever undertaken. Kind of on his own authority, he purchased the Louisiana Territory, right? That was a huge power grab, a huge territory grab. And that was Jefferson. He was both a very thoughtful, reflective individual, but he was also very much a politician. And his idea of whether you use federal power or state power was a question of what he wanted to get done. Using state power and that argument when that served his goals, and federal power and that argument when that served his goals. And I think that's been generally true of federalism, by the way, throughout our history. You know, we like to think today that Republicans are more of a states' rights party, and Democrats are more of a nation-centered party. But actually, when you start to break things down a little bit, you'll see exceptions to that within each party. You know, Republicans quite willing to use federal power for certain purposes, states' power for other purposes, and more of their purposes, in fact, are served by states' power. And the reverse is true of the Democrats. But federalism is pretty pragmatic if you're a politician. I'll tell you what I want to get done, and then I'll tell you what kind of argument I'm going to make about how to get it done, right, when it comes to federalism. That's not true of every piece of our constitutional design, by the way. That happens to be the one that the framers kind of left kind of open-ended as to what would be eventually the relationship between the nation and the states.
Well, I have about 5 more questions on this list. It's 4 o'clock. I don't know if I don't want to take up too much of your time, but if
I'm fine. I'm fine. But you know, if your students aren't, and if for some reason they don't have a question that they'd like to answer, and I kind of have to leave this space at this time, I'm pretty easy if you Google me to find my email and send me your question, and we'll start going back and forth about it. So,
okay, there's a couple I'd just like to.
Yeah, sure. I'm here. Yeah.
Because they were asked by several people, and we kind of looked at the ones who said it kind of the most conclusively. So we have Eden. She asked, what do you recommend that younger generations look for to determine misinformation or fake news from the underlying truths?
I do think that the best protection that you can have is to rely on multiple sources. You know, avoid getting yourself caught in an echo chamber where you know, the sources that you're using are pretty much all saying the same thing. You know, use alternative sources to kind of check each other. And when they're saying different things, that'll raise some suspicion that the truth maybe it lies on one side or the other, maybe in between. I've got to investigate this further. You know, echo chambers are deadly in terms of misinformation. You hear the same thing over and over again. That convinces you it must be true. But you're convinced only because those voices are saying the same thing. If you get out of it, and you hear different voices, then maybe you ought to be giving it some thought about whether it's true or not. The other thing too is I wouldn't limit my media choices to news sources. There are other places to go for information. You want really good information about COVID-19, go to the Johns Hopkins website, go to the CDC website. They're in the business of collecting reliable information. They're not in the spin business. And too many in the news business are in the spin business. So I'd augment, and you should be paying attention to the news because that helps you keep up. But use multiple sources, and then don't rely only on them as your source of information. That's the only advice I can give you. There's no magic protection for misinformation. It's often comes kind of dressed up in ways that make it look compelling. I mean, I fall for it. Everybody falls for it at some point. The idea is to kind of shed it, find ways to get rid of it. Once you grab it, don't let it take over your life or your mind, right?
So a healthy skepticism and always careful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good. It's even good with professors. You ought to be skeptical.
Yes.
I'm sure I've made some misstatements in the last hour. Come on, you can't talk for as long as I've talked without saying something that's not a little off the mark. So, a little skepticism is a good thing.
Yes. Michelle asked, and this is pretty pertinent to today's time, based on your study of the Constitution and framer intention, would you say mask requirements at the state level are in line with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, or is it a violation of freedom of speech or expression? Would a federal requirement be in line with the Constitution? Why or why not?
I think a federal requirement would be more questionable in terms of the Constitution. I don't think that the state requirement actually creates a constitutional issue. So the way the Constitution was designed, Congress was given these 17 defined powers, right? And of course, powers were given to the president, powers to the court. The 10th Amendment reserves powers not granted to the federal government, to the states. Historically, and to a large extent today, public health is one of the powers that falls under the states. And if you think about that, who licenses the restaurants and so on, it's the states. It's not, these are not federal actions, these are state actions. Public health is very much, in our system at least, a state responsibility. And the state does have in its laws, almost every state in its laws has provisions that allow the governor to deal with various kinds of health emergencies and to take measures appropriate to those emergencies. And if a governor decides that wearing a mask is one of those actions that must be taken in light of the emergency and is acting within the laws of the state, that is a very lawful action. Now, most states, even when they make those announcements, don't enforce them very thoroughly, but for all sorts of reasons, right? Police would be doing nothing but chasing people without masks, but wouldn't work very well. But but there's nothing unconstitutional. As long as there's something in the state law that allows the governor to make that kind of pronouncement.
Okay. And then we have, and this is the last one that we had several different ones who asked about this, but this one was a little bit more comprehensive. So sure. Anthony, this is from Anthony. According to the First Amendment, Congress cannot make any law hindering the right of people to peacefully assemble. Where do you think the framers of the Constitution intended for the line to be drawn in reference to the government's ability to restrict the time, place, and manner of protest? Would you say the protesters at St. John's Episcopal Church across from Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. on June 1st were unfairly dispersed and tear gassed according to the Constitution? Was the interference justifiable without reference to the context of regulated speech?
That's a really good question. So, the courts have been pretty clear about free speech and virtually every right in the Bill of Rights, that no right is absolute, right? That and that there are circumstances under which rights can be partially abridged. Sometimes rights are in conflict. One right, your right may conflict with someone else's rights, and somewhere you've got to figure out kind of where one person's right ends and the other person's right begins. And rights can conflict. I mean, if you look at First Amendment on religion, it prohibits the establishment of religion, but it also allows free expression of religion, right? So how do we think about the teaching of creationism in the public schools? Now, that's clearly unconstitutional under the Establishment Clause, but for students who believe in creationism, having to sit through a science course that teaches them only about evolution, that begins to interfere with their free exercise rights, right? Freedom to think as they would like to think. Well, those are rights in conflict. Now, in that particular case, the court has decided that the Establishment Clause trumps the Free Exercise Clause and that you can't teach creationism in public school science classes. But when it comes to free speech, there is some regulations allowed. There's some limits on that regulation. The government can't treat groups that it doesn't like differently than groups it likes. So a question that I would have for you about that protest in Lafayette Park between the White House and St. John's Church is, if that had been demonstrators demonstrating for the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, would they have broken up that demonstration? If your answer to that is no, then clearly they were engaged in unconstitutional action, because you can't favor one group over another group. And the time and manner is in part to make sure that these demonstrations, that you have a right to free expression, but you don't hugely inconvenience other people when you do so. And if you look, for example, at a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the George Floyd killing, clearly local authorities could have broken up some of those demonstrations, particularly the ones where the protesters flooded onto interstate highways, right? That is a time and manner regulation that is appropriate, and government would have been in the right to disperse those crowds to keep the highway open. You can't get a permit to do a protest in the middle of an interstate highway. It just doesn't work like that, right? They have to accommodate reasonable requests, not every request. So the question then more specifically is, did they violate those rights in the context of what happened there? We'll never get a judicial answer to that because it would come after the fact, right? So it's not like they were denied a permit or something where the judiciary could say you can't deny them the right to protest there. So it's a hypothetical, but I think in this case, I think there was a clear violation of constitutional rights. The protesters were behaving peacefully. They were in a public space. They had been protesting there and without disrupting others in any significant way. And it was clear that the president wanted some kind of opportunity to display or respond to what was going on in a rather dramatic fashion. And that was the reason why the crowd was dispersed and tear gassed. That is not a legitimate reason for government action. Now, on the other hand, I think some of what the Trump administration has done in some of the cities where vandalism rather than peaceful protest has been commonplace, I think those are appropriate actions on the part of government. Protesters have a right to protest. They don't have a right to destroy property, to assault police, to intimidate bystanders, and the like. I think some of the actions that have been taken by this president in this area are quite lawful. That one, I think, was not.
All right, well, that was the last one that I had. And we appreciate and have really enjoyed our time with you. And thank you so much. I think, thank you all who attended. We appreciate it. And if you have any final words you wanted to say, I don't know.
One, those were really great questions, and they were thoughtful. They were big picture questions. I mean, these were not kind of little small bore things. And that's where we need to be. I think as a country, I think we need to be thinking in large terms. We've got big problems that we need to deal with, not tiny ones, right? And they're not going to go away without contributions from citizens and really thoughtful answers and thinking about these issues. So I'm really heartened by what I've heard from you. And again, I'm very heartened by what the young people in this country are doing generally. There's a good future out there. I think we're not in a great time at the moment. I think there's a better time, and I think we can see where it's coming from.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Patterson. And thank you everyone for attending.